I traveled back to the United States in October, November, and I was visiting Haverhill, Massachusetts. There's a print museum there, and I've been very curious to see it. And since I'm from Massachusetts, I'm sort of surprised I'd never heard of it. And I thought, well, if I'm going back, I'm certainly going to make a side trip there. So I contacted them, and Frank Romano is the director there. And he opened the museum and gave me a private tour, which was absolutely delightful. Lovely. It was really wonderful. So I just wanted to tell you a bit about the tour and what was there. The Museum of Printing is in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and it's about an hour's drive north of Boston at 15 Thornton Avenue off Route 495 in a large nondescript brick building that belies the richness of the collection that's inside. I strolled across the parking lot to be welcomed at the front door with a sign with my name on it and Frank Romano inside, greeting me from his wheelchair. He opened the museum to give me a private tour. And I gave him a copy of James Crier's book, which talks about his father's trip across the U.S. So I'll pass that around, and you can have a look at it as you listen.
Well, Frank very kindly wrote it.
And yeah, Frank wrote an introduction or a comment at the beginning, yes. The story of the history of printing is comprehensive. And one of the things I've really loved about this museum was how it made it really accessible to the general public in a way that I would love if we could reproduce here. And the exhibits there gave me a lot of ideas for the possibilities of what we could do here if we had larger premises. Their niche collections make printing relatable to people's own life experience. The museum gave a context for letterpress printing and gave a sense of the depth of printing as an industry, and then in many ways that it's contributed to our day-to-day lives. Near the front door, there was a framed front pages of the New York Times from memorable days. I read about the walk on the moon in 1969 and realized that this was a really good way to just engage people. And I could imagine people turning to each other and saying, where were you then? But it could also start a whole discussion of printing newspapers and, that as a whole industry in of itself. Around the corner is a room full of Bibles. Now, not being religious, it came as a surprise at first. And then I thought of how many people have a family Bible and how for centuries deaths, births, and marriages were written in family Bibles. Haverhill was a center for Bible translations in the 1800s when missionaries were eager to translate the Bible into local languages to make it accessible to more people. There were Bibles in Algonquin, which is an American Indian language from that part of New England, in Chinese, and in many other languages, and also Bibles from many different time periods. And they also had a facsimile of a Gutenberg Bible, so you could go through it. Mm-hmm. So it really showed the depth of printing, and I realized that a certain group of people would be particularly drawn to the Bibles, just as to the newspapers. And I thought that was really quite a clever approach to talking about printing, because then a whole bunch of different people would say, and think about printing because of their being able to relate to it. And how Bibles would start many conversations. Around the corner from the Bible room was an elegant black and gold Columbian press, which I was comparing to ours. It was beautifully restored, and these presses were built in Europe, though they were designed by an American, George Clymer. On the left was a display of Lance Hiddey's graphic artwork, and he was the first graphic designer to use Adobe Photoshop. He modified his photographs to create unique art and integrate them within posters and postage stamps. He also designed books by the famous photographer Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams did a lot of black and white photography of the American West and duotones of national parks. Yeah. The next section displayed hand printmaking, showing both the hand-cut plates and many artwork. The tangible nature of the carved plates and their simplicity makes commercial printing understandable and accessible to the general public, because they could sort of see the plates and then see the print and start understanding the connection. So I thought that was wise for sort of people who didn't have any background in the industry to start just understanding the physicality of plates and printing. There were Anna Hogan's and Mark Fowler's monochrome woodcuts, The plates for woodcuts are made from planks of wood cut parallel to the grain. The Japanese were masters in woodcut printing. Next were Hogan and Fowler wood engravings, and these images are printed from carved blocks of end grain, that is, wooden blocks that are cut across the section of a tree. I was thinking of Andy's talk. And this means that the carved lines can be much more detailed and go in any direction compared to woodcuts, because woodcuts, you've got the sort of interruption of the grain, while if you're cutting end grain, it's much easier to cut in any direction. So as an artist, it gives you a different set of choices. The printmaker's artwork showed a range of art that was pleasing to the eye and very varied in style. And then there was a lithographic press, which would be your area, showing the plates of stones or porous limestone. Lithography was developed by a musician, Alois Sennefelder, in Germany in 1798. The displays gave a clear sense of the many ways that art could be printed by hand. Adding depth to hand printmaking, the Klein collection of woodcuts, wood engravings, steel engravings, and intaglio printed, all that was printed on an etching press. And that was familiar to me since I spent several years making and exhibiting art as a printmaker. Around the room to your right, you could see a whole row of American hand presses, similar to our Albion press. Besides that was a Hoe steam press, a flat cylinder press used for printing newspapers, books, and magazines. And as I moved from room to room, the displays built a sense of the progression through history that shows the depth and the breadth of the printing industry. Frank Romano was a delightful source of print knowledge. He narrated my tour from room to room, and I could ask whatever I wanted, and he had more to say about it, and had such a depth of knowledge. It was really delightful. In the back right corner, there were linotype machines and sort of the history of metal typefaces. In a small lecture room on the wall, there was a circular case of Chinese metal type. The characters started me thinking about alphabets and characters and the complexity of designing typefaces for alphabets in different languages. I believe Koreans developed the first movable type, but it was not commercialized because, like Chinese, there were too many characters in the language to make commercialization viable. In a long, narrow room is a workshop with Vandercook presses that can be used for art workshops, for graphic designers, calligraphers, bookbinders, papermakers, and poets to all come together for printing workshops. The cross-blending of artistic and technical fields draws together a mix of people around the art of printing, creating a vibrant community. I really wanted to return to take a workshop with them. Around the corner from the linotype machines in the back, there was a wall of typewriters. And my 89-year-old mother came with me, and in the late 60s and early 70s, she taught typing in Pitman shorthand. She could find the exact model of typewriter that she taught on when we lived in Scotland. Again, I could see how the varied displays that they included in the museum gave a great sense of the breadth of how printing and type and reproduction explained the deep contribution that the print industry had given to society in general. It also gave a context for letterpress printing as part of a much larger whole, which made it a very rich story. Then there was a step into modern times. There was a mimeograph machine, probably familiar from school worksheets with purple ink. I certainly remember it from primary school. And a Xerox copier, the first introduced, that was 1959 by Xerox. Frank Romano knew Steve Jobs, so whenever a new Apple computer came out, Frank received one as a donation to the museum. He has computers from all different stages of desktop publishing, and I certainly remember these from when I worked in advertising. He has documented this in a book, and Frank was really amazing. One of the things he's really left as a legacy is he's written, I think it was over 40 books, documenting all different parts of our industry and the very specific models that were part of that. So in desktop publishing, he listed sort of all the specific machines, and from metal to through linotype and then phototype setting. He listed all the stages of typewriters being developed. So he's documented a huge amount of our industry's development, which was fascinating and very, very detailed. this showed the history of metal type transitioning to photographic typesetting. That was familiar to me for my years working in art departments of ad agencies and graphic design studios in the 80s and 90s. There were many, many more displays, including an extensive library, and I believe he is one of the largest libraries about sort of the prints and graphics industry. It was a very large room that was just bookcases, bookcases all around it. And I was, I would love to just spend a whole day going through there. And there were so many, sample books and examples of different kinds of printing. Then you make your way and you come to a large display of the shop. And the shop was extensive and a real joy, as well as the usual mugs, T-shirts, aprons, and bags, which give something for people to walk away with from the museum. They had much more. They also had one-page print samples of cards and posters. Some of them were from workshops that had been done in the museum, so you could buy different samples of what was there. They'd also made up very witty little samples that were little stories about type or a typewriter or a printing process that had been letterpress printed, and then you could buy a few of those little samples to take away with you. So there were some really lovely ideas for merchandising, but also that were educational in what they had there. So I bought a few samples of printing that reminded me of all that I'd seen. So visually this was really a joy. There were many books that were printed at the museum workshop that were set for sale: poetry books, art books, and history of printing and printers and artists. There was the impressive array of books by Frank Romano himself, and he's really documented the progression in technology. And I would love it if we could buy samples of his books and have them in the museum or in the state library, just as a record of what has happened in our industry. It was very rich, and he's really been comprehensive in that. And Frank was just a joy to have a conversation with, because you could ask him so many things, not only about things in the museum, about the history of printing. And not only did you get an answer, but you'd have a wonderful conversation and learn more about whatever it was than you wanted to know. I ended up asking him about punctuation. And he knew the whole history of when punctuation was basically invented. And that when printing was first started, there was no punctuation, and words were just run into each other. And it wasn't till like the 1500s that people started using punctuation. And I'd never even thought about that. And I just thought, wow, there's a whole fascinating story there that I haven't even touched on. So it was just delightful. He had trouble walking and was either in his wheelchair or with a walker, but that didn't restrict my tour at all. He knew everything that was on each wall in the different rooms and could say, look to your right and you'll see this. And there it was. It was quite delightful to be given a tour and to have his explanations around the depth of the museum. So I'd love to just acknowledge and thank Frank Romano for his tour of the Haverhill Print Museum. And if you're ever traveling to Boston, Massachusetts, I would certainly suggest that you take a half day or a day and go there for a visit. Thank you.
Your permission, could that be published?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
A couple of our good friends here.